What up? Now, best give credit where credit is due, I suppose. I only became aware of this study because of the Lotus Eaters podcast. And one of the gold tier members, you see what you can do is you can make these video questions. You can come up with like video questions that you can present to the podcasters and they will answer them. And in one of these video questions, video comments rather, this study was brought up. And I was like, okay, that's very interesting. And so today I just want to go through what this study says. Just as a disclaimer, I did vote Trump in the last two elections. In case that, matters to anybody. Now, the name of the study is Mental Illness and the Left. Okay? And it starts off with, it has been claimed, it has been claimed that left-wingers or liberals tend to more often suffer from mental illness than right-wingers or conservatives. This potential link was investigated using the General Social Survey cumulative cross-sectional data set. A search of the available variables resulted in 5 items measuring one's own mental illness. All of these items were weakly associated with left-wing political ideology as measured by self-report, with especially high rates seen for the extremely liberal group. These results mostly held up in regressions that adjusted for age, sex, and race. For the variable with the most data, the difference in the mental illness measure between extremely liberal and extremely conservative was 0.39. Temporal analysis showed that the relationship between mental illness, happiness, and political ideology has existed in the GSS data since the 1970s and still existed in the 2010s. They're going to have a lot of statistical jargon throughout this, and they're also going to be citing previous studies that have been done. So if you want to see those studies, they will be listed. Another thing to note is that this is a survey. Okay, so they sent out a survey. People, I'll take that survey, and they fill out the survey. Okay, and the reality of the situation is in the United States today, generally speaking, most big cities are heavily left-leaning. Okay, whereas the rural areas are more conservative-leaning. Now, the reason why that would affect this kind of a study is because your population density is going to end up being more left-leaning or right-leaning, right? Well, at the same time, since you have a higher density of population in the city, you may get more respondents to the survey from the city than you would from a rural area, right? The rural area is not going to have as many people. Chances are not many of them are actually going to fill out the survey. And so whereas people in the city, higher chance of even coming across the survey in the first place, higher chance of filling it out. So just, let that be known. This whole survey is trying to just show some data, and it, comes up, it's able to tell you the reasons why this data may or may not be one way or the other. Okay? So this is not a attack on anyone. This is just a study, and just let that be known. All right. Now, within study, meta-analysis of all the results found that extreme liberals had a 150% increased rate of mental illness compared to moderates. This is really just kind of the summary, right? This is the abstract of the study here. The findings of increased mental illness among left-wingers is congruent with numerous findings based on related constructs such as positive relationships between conservatism, religiousness, and health in general. There's keywords because people will be searching for the study. Now, we're going to get into some more things here. This part here where it says it has been reported that left-wingers or liberals tend to more often suffer from mental illness than right-wingers or conservatives. It lists a study. It lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 studies. This suggestion is consistent with other research showing that religiosity predicts both mental and physical health. Study. Given the known strong relationship between political conservatism and religiousness, furthermore, political conservatism has been found to be associated with longevity. Now, once again, these are studies. They're showing that, okay, these are the prior studies that have been done that show why. Well, they don't really show why. They just show what, right? The answer as to why, or the answer as to why is not, in here. I have my own belief as to perhaps why, but right now we're just going to be focusing on this study. Towards the end, I may, address why I think, but we'll see. I'll do what I want. In a recent series of tweets, Lemoni 2020 analyzed data from the Slate Star Codex 2020 reader survey. N is the number of people who are in the survey. Alexander, that's the survey. That's the study. And shown that self-rated political ideology positions, 1 through 10 scale, and self-rated far-left labels were related to mental health. Since his work was not published, we reprint this figure showing the relation to the self-placement study in Figure 1. And this is Figure 1. Self-reported mental health and self-reported political label, reproduced from this study. As you can see here, 1, the self-position on left-right spectrum, where 1 equals far left, 10 equals far right. And this proportion, right? So the number of people who say that they, proportion of respondents to the survey who say they've been formally diagnosed with depression, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia by self-position on the left-right spectrum. So this is formally diagnosed. Formally diagnosed. This is not self-diagnosed. But this is a self-reporting of the formal diagnosis. And as you can see here, 32% of the respondents with an error of up to 40% and an error down to like 25% say that yes, they do suffer from either depression, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. And you'll notice that, okay, that's the extreme left. That's the far left. Well, as you get closer and closer to the right, you notice it just kind of drops down, right? Where 2 is not as far left as 1, it's still 26.6%. 3, not as far left as 2, 20.9%. 4, 17%. 5, which is like basically in the middle, 16.6%, right? 6, 15.6%, 7, 13%, and then it pops back up a little to 8, 13.5%, and then it goes up a little more from 9, 15.7%, but then the lowest is 11.8% at 10, far right. Now, maybe the far right is just a bunch of liars, because it's very just interesting that these individuals on the far left are like, oh yeah, we've been formally diagnosed. Whereas people on the right probably just haven't been formally diagnosed. Maybe they've said, yeah, we have these problems and stuff like that, but it's just not a formal diagnosis. And I think that's something to do with the political ideology in the first place. Whereas, far left seems to be towards more welfare and kind of stuff like that, where they'll be more likely to take advantage of a benefit or a program that would help them get a diagnosis in the first place. Whereas the far right would be like, no, like, fuck off, doctor. That's just what they would do, right? If I got it, I'll handle myself, man. That's just kind of what it is. So this is the self-reported mental health and self-reported political ideology. Self-reported, it's a very important part. However, the SSC survey is far from representative, being mainly limited to readers of a particular blog that attracts mainly European descent, highly intelligent readers, right? So they're just addressing the fact that this study or this survey only was really able to reach this certain kind of demographic, right? It's just important to note that while this is a study, they do their best to come up with accurate information, but at the same time, we have to take in everything else into account. We have to understand the context of the study, and we have to understand the context of the people who are answering the study. And, as I said before, chances are more left-leaning individuals would, because they live in a higher population density. And so if you were to put a survey in that population density, more chances of it being a left-leaning individual answering the survey, much higher. Data. We use data from the cumulative cross-sectional file, available for public use at, and there's a link. This has a total sample size of 64,814 individuals. Pretty fair It's a fair sample size for a study like this, or a survey like this. But not all items were asked in every wave or given to all respondents in each wave. We searched the database for items relating to mental illness. 5 items were found with at least a sample size of 1,000, shown in Table 1. 4 of these were binary, dichotomous, or one was numeric, and one was numeric. I don't know how to pronounce that word. I'll get better at it. Political ideology was measured by a 1 to 7 scale, going from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, which was available for all subjects. Figure 2 shows the distribution of political ideology by survey year, right? And so what this is this is just how many people in the year, right? So just 2,000 that year, 11,000 through those years, 2,000 those years, 1,000 those years, 1,400 that year. Just showing you that. And this kind of gives you an idea of the people who actually responded to the survey. That's what this graph is. That's what, you need to understand, that not many conservatives answered it, right? Especially extremely conservatives didn't really do that. Extremely liberal, kind of low. Liberal, kind of low. Slightly liberal, low. Moderate is up there. Moderate is way up there. So most people who answered this survey claim to be moderate, whereas down here at the bottom, it is extremely conservative and extremely liberal. Right, because obviously on the extreme ends of the political spectrum, there's going to be less people, right? On the extreme right, there's way less people than there is just regular conservatives. On the extreme left, there's way less people than there is just regular, liberals. Now, moderates are the largest group, at roughly 40% of the population. People with extreme views represent approximately 10% of the population in 2018, but only about 5% in 1975. Thus, there is a long-running tendency towards more ideological extremism, at least insofar as this self-report measure is concerned. The increase in recent years is consistent with the pattern from other sources about the Great Awakening. Okay, and then it cites these studies: Goldberg, Kaufman, Weingard, Iglesias. Results. First, we plotted the average of each outcome by political ideology and sex. We included a split by sex because sex relates to politics and sex relates to mental illness. Women higher. And ignoring sex would thus lead to some confounding. Now, what's interesting to note here is that blue is female and red is male. And as you can see here, on the extreme liberal side, the males have quite the mental illness. Whereas on the extremely conservative side, it's more like the females with the mental illness. What's just interesting is that in the middle here, it seems to show that women in general tend to kind of suffer from mental illness more than men. Whether that's because in reality that they do suffer more than men, or that they just go and they seek help and they realize it. They know they are. Versus a man who's, just really pissed off all the time, doesn't really know why, doesn't really care why, just going to drink, right? We all know men are going to act like men. Women are constantly wanting to go to doctors and figuring out what the heck's going on. And they also tend to go into psychology more. And so this just kind of shows the correlation there. That's all I really see. But I just find it interesting that for extremely conservative, slightly conservative, moderate, slightly liberal, these 4 groups all show just like what I think is the natural correlation between like men and women either seeking help for their mental illness or just knowing about it in the first place. Whereas on the extremely liberal side, you just note that these guys here have really taken to it, and I don't know. But that's what that says. Just take it for what it is. Mental health outcomes by political ideology and sex. Treatment for mental health. Error bars are 95% outlet confidence intervals. Yeah, you do have to note that these are error bars right here, right? But if an error bar is shooting up all the way up here, then your chances are you're actually pretty good. Whereas your error bar is going to be down here. This one, these small ones, it's not going to make that much of a difference. Whereas this is going to just show that in general, yeah, that's true compared to these. Another graph, percent of ever had mental health problems by this. And as you'll see here, on the extremely liberal side, the females have said that yes, they have mental health problems. They have experienced a mental health problem at some point in their life. But the men don't really seem to agree with that. But if you go back up here, makes you wonder, right? Are the men actually being honest in this situation? And who knows, right? It's that's kind of what it is about being a man, is you kind of deny things, right? It's like, oh, I'm not hurt. It's just a flesh wound, right? Now, mental health outcomes by political ideology and sex counseling over the last year. So this is a percent that have underwent counseling for mental or emotional problems over the last 12 months. That's what this is. Once again, it's separated into female and male. On the extremely liberal side, it's actually fairly even. There's not a huge difference between the males or the females, but they all have gone and they've sought counseling. And so that kind of just shows the correlation between liberals more likely to seek help from a service, because chances are they're getting paid, not getting paid, but that it's being paid for, right, or subsidized to some extent. And that just shows it, right? So if these people are more likely to go and seek counseling for what they perceive they may have a problem, then they're more likely to determine that they do have a problem. They're more likely to go about their life with that problem or get it fixed at some point in time. Whereas on the conservative side, yeah, not really. They're not about it. They don't want to take advantage of a program like that. While at the same time, those programs are going to be centered in high population areas, high population density areas, and most conservatives are going to be from like these rural areas. And so it's not as efficient to put a government program out there to handle people or to help people. And then the next graph, average days. It says mean days. Mean is average. Just math jargon. Mean days, average number of days of poor mental health over the last 30 days. Now, as you'll see here, it's actually, not a huge difference, right? We'll say at the very least, extremely conservative is like, okay, over the last 30 days, it's been about 2 days. 2 out of the last 30 days, you suffered some kind of just mental health, whatever, right? You had a little breakdown, you freaked out or something, whatever. Whereas on the far left, extremely liberal, it's about the 6 days, about 6 out of it. So it's like, 3 times as many days, but, and that's a pretty big difference, right? 4 more days of mental health problems versus 2, right? We're 6 versus 2, so it's just having 4 days and just being mentally ill. It's going to affect somebody in a way. And it's sad, but I don't think it's a huge difference, right? If it was like 10, then you'd be like, wow, that's a huge problem. Or that's a huge difference. Whereas, 6 versus 2 makes you think as to why one might possibly consider something like a mental health problem, right? For instance, if somebody answered this survey after Trump was inaugurated back in 2017, then, extreme liberal would be like, 15 days out of the 30 mental health, whereas the extreme conservative would be like, I'm so happy, not a single day, right? So it does depend on kind of like events that are occurring around these people. It depends on what's kind of going on. It depends on the context in which these people are answering this survey. Next chart, percent has emotional or mental disability. Now, on the extreme liberal side, we see the men have once again beat out the women with their mental disabilities. I don't know why. I don't know how. I don't know what the deal is, but they have. On the extremely conservative side, it actually is higher than the middle area, right? And so what you can kind of take away from this is that while the extremes and the extreme ends of the spectrum are higher than the moderate side, the far left is more likely to go and get that, whereas go and find out, whereas the far right is not likely to go and find out. The moderate area in between, from conservative to liberal, just not going extreme anyway, is actually pretty similar. They're all pretty much the same. They don't really suffer from a huge difference in mental disabilities. Right? They all pretty much have the same mental disabilities, but it's just interesting to note that from this chart earlier, when it was discussing, boy. Yeah, it was I feel like it was this one. You see that the extremely conservative over here is down, right? Now this is receiving treatment for mental health, right? These guys, the extreme liberal, are receiving treatment for mental health because they have the mental disability. On the extremely conservative side, while these people have the mental disability, they are not seeking the help. Right? Now you may say, okay, well that's pretty high. That's pretty much on the same level as liberal, right? Extremely conservative is pretty much on the same level as liberals when you're talking about ever received treatment. Whereas down here, they're not on the same level. They're a little higher than the liberal when it comes to having one in the first place. So once again, I think that kind of comes down to the ruralness, right? The fact that you're going to have a higher population density of leftist individuals than the cities, and you're not going to have that in the rural areas. And so therefore, it's going to be tougher to kind of understand the reasons why people would be answering these things this way. Now, so we continue. So we see that for mental illness outcomes, left-wing political ideology, in particular extremely liberal, predicts worse mental health. The results also hold across sexes, though the sample sizes are not large enough for the extreme groups. That's very important to note. The sample sizes are not large enough for the extreme groups because there's just not enough people answered the survey and said, oh, I'm an extreme liberal or I'm an extreme conservative, right? As the predictor did not always have a P of less than 0.05. I didn't take stats in college, so I don't know what that means. In a regression model, are the results large enough to care about? Well, one approach is calculating the Cohen's D value from the group gaps. This can only properly be done when the outcome data is continuous, shows the results for the days of poor mental health variable with which we have the most data and which is a continuous outcome. Now, Cohen's D gaps for days of poor mental health over the last 30 days by political ideology. Positive values indicate more days of poor health compared to extremely conservative group. Right? So positive values are going to say, okay, if there's a positive number here, that's more days of mental health issues. And the only two that are negative is moderate liberal and moderate slightly liberal. Those are the only two that have less days of mental health problems than the extreme conservatives. Whereas you can see all these other numbers where it says 0.04, that's not that big. That's not a huge difference. 0.07, that's not a huge difference. 0.03, not a huge difference. But if you're going to be over here looking at 0.39, where it says extremely conservative, extremely liberal, that doesn't make any sense. Look at this. It's like, I don't even know. How are they going to compare extremely conservative to extremely liberal? I just noticed that. I don't understand that at all, but let's see what they have to say about it. For the two most extreme groups, the gap is of moderate size, at least as measured by this single item. Another way to quantify it is to convert political ideology into a numeric form and correlate it with the variable. This produces a correlation of only 0.07. Hence, overall, the relationship between the two is quite weak and reaches a notable size only for extreme groups. To examine whether age was a confound, we fit a regression model for each outcome, logistic models for the dichotomous, and OLS for the continuous. Each model included political ideology, age, and sex as predictors, without any interactions, as the sample size did not provide sufficient statistical power. For each model, we projected the predicted levels of mental illness from the models using the GG effects package GG predict function study, shown in figures 4A through D. Now, what do we got here? We got percent ever personally received treatment for mental health problems, the probability, and the political ideology. As you can see here, the extreme liberals have a higher probability of seeking treatment, or rather receiving treatment, whereas extremely conservative, the error does show more than conservative, but at the same time, it's still kind of close to the slightly conservative, the moderate political, and the slightly liberal, right? But once again, the slightly liberal, and extremely liberal are more likely to receive treatment, probably because they're more likely to be in an area that has treatment available, and they're more likely to take advantage of a government program or something to that effect. Model predictions of mental health, political ideology, controlling for age and sex, treatment for mental health, error bars are 95% prediction intervals. Now, percent ever had mental health problem. As you can see here, extremely liberal has an over 40% chance of having a mental health problem. Liberal, 20%. Slightly liberal, about 20%. Moderate, like 10%. Slightly conservative, that's like 15%. Conservative, about 10%. Extremely conservative, about 10%. You'll notice the error does show that, like, okay, extremely conservative seems like you may not be giving us like the full, truth here. You may not be being honest with us, as you note that the dot is low here, but the error bar is a lot higher. So I think we're probably more like at 20% for the extremely conservatives, because extremely conservatives, chances are they're probably going to be like, nah, they're probably going to be in denial about it in the first place, Whereas, the extreme liberals going to be like, oh yeah, I got mental health problems. I need to, go all this stuff, take care of all this stuff. And it's just like, wow. Okay. Now, model projections of mental health by political ideology. Controlling for age and sex. Ever had mental health problem. Now, percent underwent counseling for mental or emotional problems last 12 months. Now, this is the counseling graph. I'm reading these figures. The title of these figures is after the graph. So that's what's going on there. So I'm probably going to start reading that. This is counseling. Now, percent that underwent counseling for mental or emotional problems over the last year. Extremely liberal, once again, like 30%. High probability of receiving counseling. Liberal, 15%. Slightly liberal, 15%. Moderate, about 10%. Slightly conservative, close to 15%. Conservative, like 5%. Extremely conservative, like 10%. Right? Now, once again, reasons for that can be all over the place, but chances are there's more counseling available in the high-density areas than there is in the rural areas. And the rural areas is where the conservative lives, and the high-density urban areas is where mostly leftists live. Now, this is the next one is mean average days of poor mental health over the last 30 days. With extremely liberal telling us that, once again, yeah, they have about 6 days out of 30 of bad mental health days. Whereas the extremely conservatives are down here at 3 to 4, so 3.5. So about, like, I don't want to say half, but it is close to half the amount of mental health bad days. Now, I don't know why that is. I think maybe perhaps being in a rural area with more trees and greens and dirt and wild animals, it might be nicer than living in like a concrete jungle with a bunch of noise going on all the time, sirens constantly going by your house or your apartment, people honking, traffic outside your door, that kind of a thing, Next one. Oh, I guess we should go over the people in the middle, but the people in the middle are about the same. right? So it seems like the moderates are at like 4.5. Now, I don't know if that's supposed to be just like a kind of condemnation of our society in general, where if you're just politically moderate, you're still having quite a few bad days. You're still experiencing mental illness on quite a few days. More than extremely conservatives, but, less than the extreme liberal. Next graph. Percent has emotional or mental disability. Probability. Well, extremely liberal, probability of them having a emotional or mental disability is more than 15%, with an error down to 10%, but this does seem to be like the error would suggest that it's probably closer to 20%, whereas liberals seem to be down here below 10%, around 10%. Well, the errors, the top part of the error is at 10%, so it's really low. Slightly liberal is about the same as liberal. Moderate, the same as liberal and slightly liberal. Same as slightly conservative. Same as conservative. Extremely conservative are saying that they have a low probability, about the same probability as the rest of these people, but while their error bar is a little more, so chances are they're actually probably more like 10% likely to have that mental illness. Once again, it comes down to they probably wouldn't even know in the first place, because they haven't sought counseling. They can't even seek counseling because the nearest counseling center is like 100 miles away. 10 miles away. Not 10 miles is not that far. I guess it depends on where you live, right? I live in Texas, right? 10 miles isn't far. 15 miles isn't far. A 30-minute drive makes good sense. It's not bad, right? It's just kind of how it is around here. Everything's so far. As before, the results show that there is some relationship between mental health and political ideology, such that left-wingers have worse outcomes. The confidence intervals are fairly wide, however. For people reporting having an emotional mental disorder or not, there was seemingly no pattern except that extremely liberal reported this higher than everybody else. As a robustness test, we ran models on whites only to avoid any potential confound with race and mental illness. Studies mentioned here. However, the results were very similar and are not shown here. So they decided, like, heck, we don't even need to show this because the results are pretty much the same. Because chances are the people who took our survey in the first place were mostly white. That's just, what I think happened there. I don't know, but that's what I think happened. But at the same time, it's very possible that there is no difference between race whatsoever. It depends on your belief, but once again, they haven't, provided any of that data for us, so we can only really speculate about it at this point in time. Where was I? Yeah, okay. Another option is to use reverse items that instead of measuring mental illness, measure the opposite, happiness or high life satisfaction. So at first they were like, okay, tell us whether or not you have a mental illness. And people did this, and they're like, okay, now let's ask another question, right? Let's ask them if they were happy. Like, how many days are you happy? Are you happy in general? Are you pretty happy, not too happy? Tell us about, how you're feeling in terms of a good way. You've told us whether or not you feel bad. Tell us, about how you feel good. Okay? The GSS has 2 items asking about happiness based on the questions. 1, taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you are very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? And 2, if you were to consider your life in general, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? The sample sizes for these were 60,000 and 2,000 respectively. Figures 5A and B show the mean happiness level by sex and political ideology. Right. So here we have 2 graphs. We'll just focus on the first one. If you were to consider your life in general these days, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? Extremely liberal is saying they're not that happy. Females say that they're happier than the males on the extremely liberal side, which shows just a pattern of males, extremely liberal males, have a lot of problems, mental health problems. They get lots of counseling. They are really unhappy all the time. Like, probably because it's not really like where they should be, in my opinion. And we'll get into that. There's actually, in this study, they talk about something like that. Just because of the difference between how men and women kind of just operate in general. Now, as you can see here, on the extremely conservative and conservative side, the men and women are both saying they're much happier than the liberals. They're saying they're a lot happier than liberals, which is incredibly interesting to me, because this liberal political ideology is all about kind of like bigger government, in my opinion, right? It's all about kind of like taking care of everybody, right? Making sure everybody's needs are met and stuff like that. And so therefore, I think there's kind of a sense of accomplishment that's missing, right? Whereas on the conservative side, it's like, yeah, we need to go out, we need to make products, we need to make things, we need to actually build something with our lives that we own, that we have. And so therefore feel more accomplished, feel a more sense of purpose. Whereas like if the government's kind of taking care of all your needs, you know, I don't think you're going to feel like you have that much of a purpose in life. You know, and I think that's very important for people, you know, to find a purpose, to be like, yo, this is what I'm here for. This is what I do, and I enjoy it. Or just in general, like, this is me building my own things, right? This is me being productive in my own way. This is me in control of my work, and owning my product, and then being able to do whatever I want with it. And I think that's just kind of where the happiness kind of generally comes from. But once again, they don't really mention anything like that there. That's just my own speculation. Then we go down to the next graph where it's just mean happiness by sex and political ideology, right? If you were to consider your life in general, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? Now, this kind of shows that everybody seems to think that they're about the same happy in general, right? But that's a huge difference between like how many days, right? Like if you were to consider your life in general these days, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? They say, oh, they're pretty unhappy on the whole. All right, then if you were to consider your life in general, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? Like, what the heck? It's pretty much the same question, but it's just this little bit different. I mean, it's kind of the same, but I feel like this graph is not nearly as different as this other graph. While they do have about the same changes in terms of extremely liberal to extremely conservative, it's much more closely packed, right? This one's very spread out, or this one's more closely packed together. And so this is political ideology self-rated. I don't know what the difference is between these two graphs. They seem like the same graph, except with a different number system on the side here. And that's probably why it's different. Mean happiness level by sex and political ideology. How happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? Okay. We see the opposite pattern, that more conservative groups have higher happiness levels on both questions. In terms of Cohen's d, the effect sizes between the extreme groups are 0.2 and 0.56 respectively. In terms of person correlations, we are as Pearson correlations, they are 0.06 and 0.11 respectively. It is unclear why the second should produce substantially larger gaps when the questions are quite similar. Yeah, that's my question. Like, there was a significant, that's what I guess that's what they're saying here, is the questions are very similar, but this one produces bigger gaps than this one. And so they're saying that it's unclear as to why that is the case. Temporal pattern. Two of the items used to have been asked for many years: bad days per month and happiness question, allowing for analysis of any temporal pattern. Because large samples are required to detect weak patterns, the waves of data were grouped at the decadal level, so by decades, I believe. Figure 6 shows the results. Yeah, and here we see days poor health over these decades, whereas happiness over these decades. So they've been measuring happiness for quite some time, and they haven't necessarily been asking the question of days of poor health as much. But as you'll see here, in terms of days of poor health, in the 2000s, extremely liberal has a lot more days of poor health than the extremely conservatives. And it's just the same for 2010s, except it does seem to be a little lower, right? So it seems to be a little lower for extremely liberal, and it seems to be a little higher for extremely conservative. That's probably because Obama was in office. Oh my gosh. That was ridiculous. The media was just the biggest brown nosers I've ever seen in my life. Just sucking him off constantly. That's what I don't like about the media. I see media going after Trump, I'm all for it. Like, go after him if he's doing something stupid, right? But don't turn around and tell me everything's all sunshine and roses when this other guy comes in and the same, if not worse, stuff is going on. And that's just kind of what I see in general. And that's one of the reasons I think is one of the effects of this. One of the creations of the mental health issues, actually, I believe, in the media that people consume. And I'll have to do something about that later on, another video on that. Right now, I just want to kind of focus on this study because going through and searching through and reading all those articles, I'm going to hate. Right? It's gonna affect my mental health. All right, but heck, I'll do it. I'll do it for everybody knows just the facts here. It's ridiculous. Now, happiness, you'll see, is kind of the same. Just everyone's like, on average, I'm very happy. I'm fine. Which begs the question as to if you are happy, but you're suffering from more days of mental health, then what is your definition of happiness? Because if you're like, oh, like, I've got all these mental health problems, I'm suffering from it, these many days, say 6 out of 30, right? That is 1/5. That is 20% of your time that you are suffering from a mental illness. You're going to sit there and say you're happy? You're going to, okay. The results show that the relationships persist across all waves of data, beginning in the 1970s and into the 2010. Cohen's D was also calculated for the same comparisons shown in the figure. Although there were some differences across decades, they were all numerically consistent in direction and probably not significantly different in most cases if formally tested. The full numerical output can be found in the statistical output. Party affiliation as alternative political measure. At the request of a reviewer, we replicated the main result in Figure 3 using the party affiliation question. This question is similar to the political ideology one, but instead asks people which party they are affiliated with, ranging from strong Democrat to strong Republican. There is also an option for third parties, but we removed this due to incompatibility with the other results as well as limited sample size, which makes the results too imprecise to interpret, right? Yeah, you can't really, in the U.S., you can't say Libertarian Party and Green Party and compare them to Republican and Democrat because you are going to get hardly any respondents from those parties because those parties are incredibly small, mainly because the Republicans and Democrats have worked together in order to suppress them and crush them. Either that or they are in cahoots, right? Like the Green Party and the Democrats back when Hillary Clinton lost. She wanted to challenge the results, but she didn't challenge the results. Instead, it was the Greens Party candidate that challenged the results. And as they discovered more votes for Trump than there were previously, they decided to stop challenging it. Smart move. Now, that's this graph. Relative risk, independent equals 1. Outcome, this is days of poor health, ever had mental problem, ever received treatment for mental health, ever got counseling in the last year, you have a mental or emotional mental disorder. Right. So in terms of days of poor health, the strong Democrat and the strong Republican, while the strong Democrat has more days of bad health than the strong Republican, both of them have less bad days of poor health than the independent. The independent seems to be the one with the most poor health here, which is very interesting. because it doesn't really match up with any of these other graphs here. Ever had mental problems? Well, the strong Democrat is, yes, had mental problems, whereas the independents and the moderates seem to be like, no, and the conservatives, while they're not nearly as much as the left, the Democrats, they still have more than the moderates, right? So once again, that kind of makes sense. If you want to say like extreme ends, if you're a strong Republican or strong Democrat, meaning like you're going to vote for that party no matter what, then yeah, you probably do have some kind of mental issue, because there has to be a certain amount of denial in order to do that, right? There has to be a certain amount of looking the other way in order to do that, because neither party is perfect, right? Both parties have issues. Both parties have the people in them that are just crap, right? Both parties have people that just do bad things, and you can't sit there and be like, well, that's okay, because that's not a problem. Sure, you can be caught smoking meth in a hotel room with some poor stripper guy who's now unconscious, and it's just like, okay, but we'll still vote for the guy because he's a Democrat. Like, come on, come on, guys. And the same on the Republican side, right? Strong Republican be like, oh, sure, he committed voter fraud, but we'll still vote for him. It's just like, come on, you got to have some kind of mental illness in order to do that. Party affiliation, mental illness measures. Okay, yeah, right. Ever received treatment for it? Conservatives, no. Strong Republicans don't get that treatment. Strong Democrats get that treatment. Why? Well, I mean, I believe it's because they want those programs in the first place, and they want that kind of stuff, and so they go and they seek it out. Doesn't seem to help them out, to be honest. Seems like they still have more mental problems, and they still have more bad days than the conservatives. And so one may ask if perhaps the counseling is the problem, right? If you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist and people are walking into your office and you keep telling them that they don't have any problems, there's no reason for them to continue seeing you, you're going to be out of a job pretty soon. So you pretty much want to sit there and tell people like, yeah, you got problems, just keep coming in. Now, next one. Got counseling, emotional mental disorder, right? The emotional mental disorder may be the reason why they're getting counseling, or maybe the other way around, where they get the counseling and then they're diagnosed with the emotional mental disorder. We don't know. All we know is that strong Democrats say that they have more emotional mental disorders than strong Republicans. And there's actually a somewhat linear graph there, whereas it comes down to where Democrats and independents are about the same, but they're all kind of the same except for the extreme conservative. It just kind of tapers down from strong Democrat to strong Republican. Now, with the four binary measures, the pattern is roughly the same as the prior analysis. However, for the continuous outcome, the days of poor health, we see a non-monotonic pattern such that independents actually score higher. Even in this sub-analysis, however, strong Republicans are quite far below their counterpart. We don't know why that is. The individual estimates of mental illness measures are somewhat unreliable, owing to the small number of persons in the extreme groups. Right, yeah, on the extreme ends of the spectrum, you're not going to have as many people, so you're not going to have as many people being able to say this. So you could say it's unreliable because everybody on the extreme ends are going to be like, yeah, problems. Whereas people in the middle are going to be like, nah, we're all right. To overcome this limitation, we can meta-analyze the findings from Table 3AE. Is this the correct table? The main issue here is that they are not the same scale, and even those on the same scale have different base rates. Thus, to facilitate comparison, the data were converted into relative risk relative to the moderates. Bootstrap standard errors were computed by resampling individuals and then computing all downstream statistics 1,000 times. This was done because it was unclear how to calculate analytic error bars for these data, which were converted into RR and originated from different scales, as well as having some degree of non-independence between values due to multiple questions asked in the same wave in some cases. And Figure 8 shows the results. Figure 8. This is the meta-analysis of mental illness indicators on relative risk scale compared to moderates. As you can see, the mean relative risk compared to the moderates for the extreme liberal is very high. As you go down to extremely conservative, it gets lower. You can just kind of see this correlation that as the further, if you start off on the extreme right and you move to the extreme left, that risk kind of just grows up and goes higher. The results confirm the general pattern from before, namely that there is a strong elevated risk for mental illness among the extreme liberals, plus 150%. That's what they're saying. They're saying 150% risk of having a mental illness among extreme liberals. And a small increase among the liberals and slightly liberals, right? So you're just a little liberal or you're liberal, it's not that much difference, but there is something of a difference. And somewhat lower rates among conservatives and extreme conservatives. Breaking the pattern, slightly conservatives had a marginally increased rate. A variant of this analysis was also carried out by including this happiness metrics reverse-coded. This produced materially the same pattern, but was weaker since the happiness items had a weaker relationship with political ideology than the mental illness variables had. Now, breaking the pattern where it says the slightly conservatives had a marginally increased rate of plus 6%, that is very interesting, and you have to wonder kind of what made that happen on that day, right? It's very possible that something may have been going on in the outside world that when they were answering this question, this is the answer they gave. At the same time, we don't know what could have possibly been the case, but it just says this is the data, take it for what it is, and come up with your own conclusions, test your own theories as to why, and that kind of thing. And so here we just come to the discussion part where they discuss what they believe all this data is. But it's very important to note that this is just a study done with a limited number of people, right? They didn't ask everybody in the country, and they didn't ask everybody in the country on the same day. If you want to be a part of studies and surveys like this, you can find them on the internet all over the place. However, if you also want to get paid for taking surveys like this, you can go to swagbooks.com, which is a place where there's lots of different surveys, lots of different stuff, but they'll pay you maybe $1, maybe 50 cents. It's not much. It's you're talking prison wages on Swagbooks, but still, it's better than getting paid nothing for doing a survey. And some of the surveys are actually pretty cool and fun, and some of them actually do affect things, and it's kind of nice to see you took a survey and then on the news somebody's like, oh, this survey come out, and it's like, hey, I answered that question, hey, I'm part of that survey, hey, look at that. Now, the present study investigated a large data set of representative adult Americans to see whether there was a relationship between political ideology and mental health. Prior research and media claims had indicated these variables were related such that left-wing ideology was associated with worse mental health. And the studies are mentioned. Study. The results of the present study are in line with previous claims, in particular concerning people who reported being extremely liberal. Though this is a small minority of persons in the study, about 5% in the 2018, it is notable that the question, based on the largest sample size, 11,000 respondents spanning the years of 2002 to 2018, days of poor mental health last 30 days, showed one of the most consistent patterns, both in the simple average by sex when adjusting for age. The effect size between the two extreme groups was 0.39D, thus of moderate size, as both variables are single-item measures which have limited reliability. The true score effect size would perhaps be around 0.5, assuming that 0.7 retest reliability, and names these studies. On the other hand, the correlation between the variables is only 0.07. So they're really just getting into numbers here. But they're just kind of wanting to talk about how, these were the claims beforehand. These are the studies that were done beforehand. This study seems to support these claims and support these other studies, seem to be consistent. But just important to note, the sample sizes, the number of people that are actually answering, right? And so, is the effect large enough to care about? It may depend on whether one is interested in people with extreme political views, roughly in the top 10% of extremism, like 5% on either side. There is evidence that most political discourse and activism is done by highly interested, generally intelligent people, cites a study, who also tend to be more ideologically consistent and thus more represented among the extreme groups. They cite the study again. Thus, one might expect that among such people, the left-wing political activists would tend to be more mentally ill than the equally extreme right-wing political activists. I mean, yeah. I mean, just from what we've seen over the last 4 years, makes sense to me, but we'll see. We'll go on and we'll check it out. The right wing does have their crazies, but not nearly as many crazies, and not nearly as dangerous of crazies, as far as I can tell. Take it for what it is. With regards to etiology, this kind of cross-sectional study is not highly informative. Both mental illness and political ideology are substantially heritable, according to these studies, and both are moderately to strongly related to broader personality differences, according to these studies. A good start would be doing a multivariate behavioral genetic study to assess the degree to which the relations are due to common genetic variants or shared environmental, right, which includes upbringing. Based on prior findings, Kierkegaard, 2018, that's just a study, it is unlikely that the shared environment contributes substantially to the relationship. And so right there, they're just trying to talk about like as to like kind of why these things are happening. And it's just like it's more studies should be done. Studies should be done on people in cities. Studies should be done on people outside the cities. Studies should be done with people who have big families or people who are in small families. That kind of stuff. However, even finding common genetic variation would not necessarily be terribly informative regarding causality. It is possible that mentally ill people select into extreme left-wing views, or that being in an extreme left-wing context results in mental illness. Right. It's it's similar to kind of what I was bringing up earlier, where it's like the people who are getting more counseling. It's possible that you went into the counseling without a mental problem, came out with the mental problem, or you had the mental problem and then you went in for counseling, right? It's and you may say, oh well, how could you go in without a mental problem and come out with a mental problem? Well, the guy tells you you have one, and so then you tell us you have one, and so then what are we gonna do? Tell you that you don't have one, and then you go back to your guy and be like, these people are making my problem worse. And it's just like, stop paying that person. They might be screwing you over. But anyway, I digress. It's interesting that they do bring that up, and yeah, I think that's a fair point to be made. It is also likely that both are caused to some degree by other factors that are not measured or mentioned here. Right. A lot of other factors could be included here. With regard to overlap between contexts, it is well known that academics lean extremely to the left and show high rates of mental illness. Study. Right? They got studies here. They're citing their work. I just want to read that again. It is well known that academics lean extremely to the left, especially the softer fields, right? Which is, I think is funny how they call it the softer fields instead of the the hard fields, where it's actually difficult to get a degree in it, and show high rates of mental illness. There are also reports of increasing rates of mental illness among students and PhD students in particular. Now, you may ask, why is that? Is it because they had it before going into that PhD program or that university program? Or were they fine before they went in and then were mentally abused while there until the point they developed one? Right? And I can see that. University, it's not the best thing for mental stability, in my opinion. Especially if you're leaving your family, leaving your hometown, and you're having to go and you're living by yourself with a brand new total stranger, and your dorm isn't all that nice looking. You don't have a lot of personal items around. While it may be liberating and nice, at the same time you may want to kind of hold on to that, family connection, which would better help you handle the stresses of even being in college in the first place. But it's just one of those things. Where was I? All right, this next paragraph. This suggests that there is perhaps something about being in university that is causal for mental illness, and probably also encourages people with poor mental health to self-select into it. A promising route would be to look at people who were somehow randomized to attend college or not, or to become a PhD student or not, perhaps as a result of a lottery or for scholarships. This would remove the possibility of self-selection and thus be informative about the degree of causality from university attendance or employment to mental illness. It would also be informative to locate data sets with longitudinal data between the variables to see if mental illness in childhood or teens predict later entry into academic employment, thus suggesting self-selection rather than causal effects from the academic environment. Similarly, one could do a longitudinal study to see if people leaving academia tend to become happier. Yeah. And so they're right now suggesting what studies could be done in order to find out what causes this, if anything causes this, whether it exists before or whether it's brought along later on through actions and environment and behavior and stuff like that. And so they're just suggesting future studies. Limitations and suggestions, right? We're going to go over the limitations of the study because it's very important for people to note that, nothing's like 100% perfect, spot on. Like, everything's got some error associated with it. There can be all kinds of factors that affect the answers. And so it's just important to note this. The study has a number of limitations. First, since we were limited to single items, there is a question of whether these tap into the construct of mental illness properly. Generally, research on single item measures of mental health find that they are useful, cites a study. Some prior research on the topic employs stronger methods such as looking at the voting pattern of people who are institutionalized or hospitalized for mental illness, and also found a left-wing association. Cites this study, cites that study, cites that study, cites that study. Thus, construct validity does not seem a plausible issue, as the reliability of single items is usually estimated to be around 0.7. The observed relationships would be somewhat stronger if adjusted for this measurement error. For instance, the correlation of 0.07 between bad mental health days and political ideology would become 0.09, while the Cohen's D between extreme liberals and extreme conservatives of 0.39 would become 0.56. Second, the sample sizes were not always sufficient to estimate differences with confidence for the extreme groups. Once again, we got to understand that it's sample sizes, the number of people who would be answering the survey. Probably going to have more people from the left doing it than people on the right, just because of population densities and cities that are going to tend to be more left-leaning. We used all the available data as of this time. Our use of meta-analysis across items uses the available data in an optimal way to increase statistical certainty. Research should attempt to find large surveys that use better measures of mental illness and include a measure of political ideology. Another alternative is to scrape data from political activists online, e.g. Twitter, and examine it for indicators of mental illness. I think they should. That wouldn't be too bad, right? Just like take these tweets from these political activists and be like, all right, just look for signs of mental illness. I think that'd be pretty good. A third option would be to sample persons already known to have severe mental illness issues and examine their political views, as already done in a number of small studies of voting behavior among patients in mental health facilities. Cites a study, cites a study, cites a study, cites a study. This could be done via the internet, since various online survey companies allow targeting of specific subgroups, such as those with a diagnosis of mental illness. Right. Swagbucks is one of those places, right? You fill out like a pre-form in order to find out whether or not you're a data set that they could actually need versus a data set that they already have like an oversaturation of. And so there are sites like that, and you can help with these surveys if you want. You can even use them to get back at people you don't like, right? If you find that a certain company's got a survey out for a certain product and you know that company sucks or you hate that company, you can just trash their survey. You can just trash that product on their survey. You can do that. That's it's one of those things. Third, a thorny issue is whether there is measurement invariance by group. In the case of single items, one cannot conduct measurement invariance testing since differential item functioning tests rely upon other items to estimate their parameters. One reason to believe there might be measurement bias is that left-wing political views are on the whole more friendly disposed towards people with mental illness. Cites a study. And thus may be more willing to seek help, get diagnosed, get treatment, and even admit their problems to themselves. Yeah, I mean, makes sense. But at the same time, somebody who goes to seek treatment may not necessarily have a mental illness, but will be diagnosed with one. You never know, right? It's not like going to the doctor where it's like, okay, wow, you've got cancer. We need to, treat this cancer. You can feel the effects of it. You can really, tell that you have something like that, or a cold or something like that, right? Whereas if somebody's like, you got a mental problem, if you yourself didn't know that you had something wrong with you before going in, then be wary. If you go in and you're like, no, I know something's wrong, then you can probably be more acceptance of it. This sort of measurement bias could be examined using standard methods such as multi-group confirmatory factor analysis and DIF, especially if one used a heterogeneous set of items or tests. A number of studies have examined other groups where one might expect measurement bias exists and found it lacking, citing studies. Finally, one might look at objective or other ratings of mental illness. Among objective indicators, the suicide rate could be useful as it represents a concrete action that is difficult to misinterpret. Various research shows that conservative and religious people have much lower suicide risk, suggesting lower rates of mental illness among conservative and religious people, cite studies. However, this is actually a pretty big however, the same argument could be made that here suicides are a faulty indicator because Abrahamic religions have laws against them, which result in fewer suicides despite equal rates of mental illness. Yeah, that's very true. While measurement invariance issues cannot at present be ruled out, they seem implausible considering that every available indicator examined has the same direction of effect. Fourth, similar to the use of a single item to measure mental illness, the use of a single item to measure political ideology is questionable. Various factor analytic studies of politics find that one can in general not easily summarize the views of a general population into a simple one-dimensional scale like typically done in studies, including the present. It cites these studies, right? It's hard to just take one thing and say this population of people are this, because everybody's so different, right? Even if everybody's a Democrat, they're going to have little differences in there. Even if everybody's extremely liberal, they're going to have their little disagreements and stuff like that. They may even have big disagreements on big topics and stuff like that. It's just important to note. Oh, by the way, yeah. Cite the studies. Many researchers advocate 2 or 3 dimensional approaches. It is likely that the pattern found in this study will turn out to be more complicated if such measures were used. In order to keep the analysis simple here, such more advanced measurements were not attempted, but left for future studies. At the request of a reviewer, we did conduct an extra analysis using the party affiliation measure, and this showed weaker relationships than the political ideology measure, and in one case, a different non-monotonic pattern. The reasons for this are unknown, but deserve investigation. Yep. Man, oh man. And then it just kind of references. Just references. So is that Wu-Tang? Okay, no, that's Wu-Chang. I was like, what? Well, I thought I was going to see Wu-Tang Clan there. Man. Right, so what this is saying is that while they see this correlation, the claims have been made that the far left have just mental illness problems far more than the far right. They seem to say that, yeah, that is in fact true. The reason why is not. They don't even go into the reason why. They ask questions and they cite possible studies that could be done in the future to determine the reason why. I myself have my own suspicions. Right, I suspect the media is very, very big on this. if you Google News, you look at Google News under Trump, it was not a bunch of good stuff. You look at Google News under Biden, it's going to be a little different. And so I think the environment is kind of important, and the media that's being pushed out is kind of important, right? At the time these surveys being done, it should be noted, which side has the political upper hand in office, which side holds the executive branch. That might be, a good addition to a study like this. It's very interesting. Really take away from this study is that, yes, the further left you go, the more chances of having mental illness. Why? Well, it could be that everybody's just as mentally ill, but you're the only ones really getting counseling and finding it out. Or it could be that going over to that political ideology and believing it makes you mentally ill, because you quite literally live your day-to-day life believing something that is very concerning. Something that where it's like, yo, are you all right? Because you just spend too much time just like thinking about one particular thing. And so you become, you kind of work yourself up into this mental illness. And you work yourself up into anxiety, work yourself up into depression. My advice for anybody that is, having just anxiety issues, look at your habits. If you're picking up your phone all the time and you're looking through the news on your phone all the time, that's gonna add to your problem. I remember I did that for a while, and eventually I was just like, fuck my phone. I'd pick it up as if I was gonna go outside with it, and I'd be like, ugh, I'd just toss it onto my bed. Like, no, get rid of this. Now I hardly even charge it. Buddy like knocking on my door is like, hey, dude, you get my text? You here get my call? It's like, nah, man, my phone's fucking out. Like, shit. Hey, buddy. I'm like asleep in bed. Buddy's knocking on my door. See, I kind of want to go. I want to go back to that. I'd rather talk to people on the phone, see people in real life, just like send letters and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong. This texts and social media stuff, it's all cool. It's all good. Maybe Twitter, except for Twitter, right? Twitter's not all that good. Suppose it depends on what you use it for. I only really used it to be, say a bunch of nasty shit. Just say a bunch of bad shit. And so I was just like, this is not good for me. So I got off of it. But, while this stuff is good and all, I kind of just want to go back to, the whole writing letters thing. Like, why not? I feel like nowadays, writing a letter and sending it to somebody just has a lot more meaning to it. A lot more effort put into it. And so if you're putting a lot more effort into it, then you care more about, what you're saying and how it might affect somebody. Whereas, if it's Twitter, you're just kind of just throwing up onto the internet. It's basically what you're doing. You're just pulling your pants down and dropping a huge poo on the internet. Oh gosh. But yeah, I kind of don't like text messaging anymore. You just don't understand what people are saying. So from now on, whenever I communicate with people, I might just send them video messages, because that's like the only way to really get it across, right? The only way to accurately get what you're trying to say across. Somebody's like, oh, here's this. Read this article. And I'm just like, that's a satire site, right? It's just like, no, it's not. And it's like, dude, that's a satire site. But yeah. Oh.